Oh, good evening. Welcome to another edition of Evenings with Steve. This is my 20th program over 2 years. And once again, I'm just thrilled to be with you tonight. The program was originally called The Political Future of Israel. And then I thought about it for a moment, and I have one of America's leading experts on the Middle East, someone who has served at the highest levels of government for a number of American presidents from both political parties. And I thought, who knows? Maybe there'll be some international conflict, something that will arise that I'll want to ask Dennis Ross about. So I changed it to diplomacy in Israel's political future. And of course, here we are. And I just want to tell you something else before I start the program. And that is that I do a lot of research for these programs. I read the guest books. I watch and listen to some of their interviews, and tonight is going to be a very special program. So with that background, let me introduce our guest for tonight, Dennis Ross. Dennis, welcome to the program. Thrilled to have you with us tonight.
Really happy to be with you. Thank you, Steve.
So, we have in the green room, while our viewers were waiting for us to start, they listened to this very powerful song by Sting about the Russians loving their children. It was written during the Cold War, but it resonates today, and Sting re-released it. And I thought it was almost poetic that with that song and the events of today, where Russia launched an airstrike on a maternity hospital, where children were hit. Russians love their children in a maternity hospital and children being hit. I have to start with this question. What is this war all about? What is Putin's goal? What's his end game?
I think if we ask what Putin's goal was going in, it was based on a miscalculation on his part. What I mean by that is he expected that he would, with a kind of shock and awe, go in. The Ukrainian government would collapse. The Russian army would be immediately welcomed. He would install a new government. The message he would send to Ukraine's neighbors, to Eastern Europe, would be one of intimidation, that you will play according to our rules. We're now the arbiter. These are no longer the rules the US created at the end of the Cold War. Ukraine will be a vassal of Russia, and none of the states that joined NATO after 1997 will have any real freedom of choice in terms of what their orientation is with regard to foreign policy or national security. His aim was to use the retaking of Ukraine as not just a reestablishment of a sphere of influence for Russia, but a demonstration that Russia now was an arbiter on the world stage. Recall that President Obama referred to Russia as a regional power. Well, here is Vladimir Putin. In his mind, he was going to demonstrate unmistakably Russia was a world power, and in its own neighborhood, its law, it determined what the law was. That was the goal going in. Now the question becomes, given this colossal miscalculation on his part, dramatically overestimating the effectiveness of his forces and the power of his forces, dramatically underestimating the Ukrainians. In a sense, I like to say he drank his own Kool-Aid. I mean, he believed what he said, that Ukraine wasn't an independent country. And therefore it was natural. He could go in and do this. Within a day or two, it would be over. He would create a fait accompli. Now, none of that happened. He expected that kind of result. He had $630 billion in reserves. He thought that would provide a cushion for him. He didn't understand that more than half of those assets are in banks in the West, and therefore they've now been frozen. He never thought there would be a unified response of the Europeans, United States, and Canada. He never thought that. He thought that whatever the words would be, there wouldn't be real practical behavior. So now he has to deal with having miscalculated everything. And that's too big a leap for him right now. He hasn't made that yet. So what you're seeing, he's doing what I call the Grozny rules, what he did in Chechnya. It's a scorched earth approach. Maybe it's not quite as extreme as that, but it's pretty close. You know, his military on the ground has found it very difficult dealing with this kind of resistance. And so what does he resort to? He resorts to missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, long-range artillery, some aircraft. This is a guy who basically now feels the need to show he didn't lose, now feels the need to try to force a surrender on the part of Ukraine. And that's why you're going to see an effort to depopulate increasing parts of the country, to hold cities under siege, to turn off their electricity, their water, to try to make it unlivable and force the government to give in. Now, if this Ukrainian government continues to survive and fight on for another couple of weeks, then he's going to have to find a way out. And, you know, there are those who are talking to him now, including the Israelis, who feel he's signaling the beginning of a move in that direction. I've just returned from there. One of the things I was saying to him is he's not ready yet. It's good to be ready when he is, but he's not ready yet.
We're going to come to that visit to Israel in my next question, but just as some background, one of the extraordinary features of Russia's war against Ukraine is Israel's role, and Naftali Bennett, the prime minister of Israel's role, in an attempt to mediate the conflict. Yeah. And indeed, Naftali Bennett went last Saturday, a trip to Moscow, met with Putin. Yesterday, President Zelensky of Ukraine tweeted his gratitude, his thanks to Prime Minister Bennett, and thanked Israel for its attempt to mediate the conflict and to stop the war and the violence. So with that background, I want to ask you, how surprising it is that Israel took this role. But again, you've just come back from Israel this morning. What timing for this program. You met with a wide variety of high-level officials, and I'm certainly not going to ask you to name those officials, but we know they're at the top echelon of government. And surely this mediation effort was the subject of your discussions. Can you tell our audience what happened in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, obviously at one level I went to talk much more about Iran. I ended up talking a lot about Iran, but also a lot about Russia and Ukraine.
Right.
Partly because I have a background in it, partly because they had already, by the time I got there, President Zelensky had asked on a number of occasions if the Israelis would mediate, even before the conflict. And then once it erupted, once the Russians invaded, right, then he again came back to the Israelis. While I was there were conversations almost every day with him. And so the Israelis were trying to think through, okay, how do we go about something like this? This is not a conflict we're a party to, but it's a conflict in which we have stakes. We have a significant Jewish population in Ukraine that is now vulnerable. We don't know what the implications of this conflict are going to be within Russia. We have a significant Jewish population in Russia. We have Russia on our border in Syria. And we are facing what is a profound strategic threat of Iran trying to put precision guidance on top of well more than 100,000 rockets that they have provided to Hezbollah. We need the freedom of action to be able to operate there to blunt what the Iranians are trying to do, and the Russians could make that much more difficult for us. So there were a lot of considerations to take into account on the Israeli side. And in my conversations with a number of people, they were raising questions about, what would be the downside of a mediation? How would one position oneself better? How do you know when you're at a point when mediation has some chance to succeed? How would you start? Is this just passing messages back and forth? I mean, in a sense, a lot of this was sort of looking almost even conceptually. How do you think about a mediation? How do you protect yourself? I mean, the Israelis understood at a time when there's an effort being made to make Putin a complete pariah if you go and you see him. Well, you're sort of breaking this phalanx
Right.
of trying to raise the cost to him of what he's done. So there were a lot of considerations, and they were, I thought, quite thoughtful in terms of how they were trying to think through what they would do. And as you said correctly, Naftali Bennett is an observant Jew. He is modern Orthodox, and he's the first kippah-wearing prime minister. And he obviously keeps the Shabbat. So for him to go on Shabbat, it was a way to do it secretly. This was not an effort to draw attention to Israel. It was an effort to do something very practical and to be helpful in any way that Israel could. So, and Zev Elkin went with him also keep Shabbat. So this made it easier to do it secretly, but obviously they felt, you have a dispensation if you're going to try to save a life. Well, they were trying to save a lot of lives.
And just for benefit of our audience, who is Zev Elkin?
Zev Elkin is one of the ministers in the government. Originally grew up in Ukraine, fluent in Russian, was Bibi Netanyahu's interpreter, even though he was a longtime major figure in Likud party. He helped to form New Hope with Gideon Sa'ar when they felt that Netanyahu was taking on the basic institutions of the state, and they felt this was actually a threat to democracy. He's definitely on the right side of the political spectrum. I mean, certainly leans towards the right wing, but has a strong familiarity with Russia, knows Putin, was in a position, I think, to help not just interpret, but to make sense of what they were hearing. He is one of the few people who actually predicted that Putin would do exactly what he did in terms of an all-out invasion. So he was with the prime minister.
You in a previous interview, you indicated Naftali Bennett is someone who's true to his ideology, but as someone who has a vast amount of experience in solving problems. So again, without going into the specific conversation you had with these high-level Israeli officials, did you temper their expectations, or do you think that there is a chance of these mediation efforts actually being successful and brokering a peace between Russia and Ukraine?
Look, I think the key with everything else comes back to Putin. This is a conflict that he provoked, he started. He will be the one who determines, in a sense, whether you're going to have a peaceful outcome to it or not. If he's looking at a certain point for a ladder to climb down, it's not that the Israelis bring great leverage. I mean, you want, as a mediator, you want leverage. You want there to be a consequence for saying no when you're a mediator. Naftali Bennett and Israel are not in that position. But if Putin is looking for a way out because the cost has become too high, and we're looking at the estimates, the low estimates are that they've lost 3,000 soldiers. It's quite remarkable. 3,000 soldiers in less than 2 weeks. The higher end estimates range as high as 10,000. I mean, at a certain point, put the economic price that Russia is going to pay if the sanctions don't get lifted. It's going to last. It's going to last for years. So there's a high price there, but there's a high price in terms of the Russian military. So there could come a point where Putin looks for a way out. I don't think he's there yet. The Israelis may feel he is closer to that point than I do, but I think that fundamentally they saw that they could play a role that could be helpful, and they felt an obligation, as Naftali Bennett said, a moral obligation. When you see this kind of really horrendous, this is a war. Every war is horrendous. This one, when you see, as you described, a maternity hospital being targeted, it, it's not unique in what is happening right now. And it's a reminder that we all collectively need to see if there's a way we can bring it to an end. The Israelis in this particular case are taking on a responsibility, not because they think they can necessarily succeed, but because they think the effort by itself could make a difference. And even if you can make a small difference, given what the consequences are, it's worth making that effort.
Dennis, Israel's being actively involved in humanitarian efforts in Ukraine, offering medical aid, accepting refugees, and as we've already alluded to, being a central figure in mediation efforts. Do you think that this could have some enduring beneficial effect on Israel's standing in the international community?
The short answer is yes. Obviously, if it ends up playing a more pivotal role in terms of bringing a conflict to a conclusion, obviously the benefits are even greater. Israel's detractors are not going to be put off by this because they're motivated by something fundamentally different. They are motivated by really a desire to, I think, discredit, delegitimize Israel. They really don't believe that Israel should exist, meaning they don't believe that, the way I put it, the Jewish people have a right to self-determination. It's why a lot of those who are anti-Zionists are also anti-Semitic. And I define this. You can be critical of Israeli policy. There are Israeli policies that deserve criticism.
Right.
But when you apply a standard to Israel that you apply to nobody else, then you understand that this is not about being anti-Israeli, it's about being anti-Semitic. And when you're trying to discredit or delegitimize Israel's right to exist, this is not legitimate criticism. This is about, again, reflecting and revealing very much who you are.
I want to encourage our viewers to send in questions. We only use your first name, and it'd be wonderful to engage Dennis with questions from you. So Dennis, you wrote a book, your latest book, and it was shown in the green room. It's titled "Be Strong and of Good Courage: How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny." I've read the entire book. It's excellent. And you profile 4 of the leaders in Israel's history. And not only were they ideologically diverse, some of them knew each other, they hated each other, didn't get along, which I know from reading the book and from my own knowledge of Israeli history. And they were David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, and Ariel Sharon. And so with these disparate backgrounds, why did you choose these 4 leaders, and what did they have in common?
First, thanks for the question, and thanks for the comment about the book. The reason was, even though, as you said, they were very diverse ideologically, they had something fundamental in common. They all defined leadership and the responsibilities of the prime minister the same way. They all felt that you put the country first, not your politics. They all felt that you don't defer decisions, you make them. It's not up to your successors to bear the brunt of responsibility. It's up to you to bear that brunt and to assume that responsibility. All of them basically had this capacity to see what was real, not to deny, not to live in a world of denial, but to see what the challenges were and be prepared to face up to them. As diverse as they were, that was something that was consistent with all of them. They were all people of very strong character. Look, no one's perfect, so they all had their flaws, but they also were extraordinarily determined. And they had, what I would say, wasn't just that they put the country first as opposed to their politics or their party, is that they had the strength of character. They didn't kid themselves. This was not they didn't live in a fantasy world. And so, this is something that typified all of them. I have to say, the more we got into this book, the more I came to admire them. Now, the truth is, 2 of them I knew extremely well. I spent an enormous amount of time with Yitzhak Rabin, and the same with Ariel Sharon. So I knew them very well. Begin and Ben-Gurion were before my time. And so that was, for me, that was more of in a sense, relating to them through the history. But the history was so profound. And these were unbelievably extraordinary figures. I mean, David Ben Gurion was an autodidact. He was completely self-taught. He taught himself 13 languages. He read the original, he wanted to read the original philosophers in their language, Greek. He taught himself Greek so he could read Plato, Aristotle. He wanted to read it in the original. This is someone who had an uncanny ability to understand strategically where things were headed. Obviously, he had a vision of which he was able to act on ensuring that the Jewish state would come into being. But he had a lunch with Charles de Gaulle in 1960, and in Paris, and de Gaulle said to him, "What's the most important thing for you? What do you need the most?" And he said, "More Jews." Without missing a beat, more Jews. And de Gaulle said, "Well, they're certainly not going to come from here." Famous last words. He said, "Where are they going to come from?" And Ben Gurion said, "They'll come from the Soviet Union because it'll collapse in 30 years. This was 1960. When did it collapse? 1991.
Right.
It wasn't only this. I mean, he in 1932, he foretold of what he saw was a great war coming to Europe.
Right.
A great threat to the Jews. He was an extraordinary figure in terms of his strength of character, his determination, which was, I think, he probably had no equal when it came to that. He willed things. Literally, when people talk about Ben Gurion, they would say he literally willed things. But he was also this extraordinary strategic analyst with a capacity to understand in ways that very few, if any, of us have.
So when I was at University of Toronto, my minor was in history, and I know that when you study history and when you write about history, as you have here, there's always a contemporary message that you want to send out from the study. And so my question to you is, I'm going to make the assumption that you do have a contemporary message. What is it that resonates from your study of these four formidable historical figures that carries through as a contemporary issue?
Well, you're right. Absolutely. There was a premise to this book. The premise was that Israel is facing some big decisions about how it defines its own identity in the future. If you take two states off the table, and when I say that, it's not because I think two states are possible anytime soon. They're not possible anytime soon. If we had a Palestinian state soon, it would be a failed state. We don't need one more failed state in the Middle East. But two states, when you take it off the table and you leave only one state, Palestinians will say, fine, one person, one vote. And that will resonate. That will resonate in the United States. That will resonate in Canada. That will resonate throughout the Western world. That is not where Israel wants to end up. So in a sense, to make a decision to preserve the possibility of separation from the Palestinians is a tough decision, because the weight of the settler community in Israel is quite strong. And the image of the Palestinians in Israel is quite negative. So the combination of the settler movement is strong, Palestinians are viewed through a very negative lens. The peace camp in Israel was killed by the Second Intifada. If you emphasize peace, you're seen as a friar, a sucker. So all that creates a very formidable political environment, a tough political environment, to say, you know what, we're going to stop building to the eastern security barrier. We're going to build in that 7 to 8% of the West Bank closest to the Green Line, because that's consistent with separation and consistent with a two-state outcome. We're not going to keep building to the east of the barrier, because we're going to pass the tipping point, and there'll come a point past which we won't be able to separate from the Palestinians, and then we'll be stuck in one state. So this book was saying, all right, big difficult, hard, courageous political decisions are going to be required, not for the faint of heart. And here were four leaders who understood that, and they acted that way. And Israel needs that kind of leadership again. That was the motivating drive of the book.
So we look at Ben-Gurion as the visionary. We look at Yitzhak Rabin as the pragmatist, the realist. Now we have this new prime minister, Naftali Bennett. The election took place on March 23rd, almost exactly a year ago.
Yeah.
He's been in power for several months now. Do you foresee a day where Naftali Bennett could be an additional chapter in the second edition of your book?
It's possible. Look, he did something that is in keeping with these other leaders. He genuinely believed, whether he was right or he was wrong, he genuinely believed that the state of Israel's democracy was at risk, that Benjamin Netanyahu had been in power for so long, and the indictments against him and his response to that, his challenge to the judiciary, his challenge to the police. Bennett believed that Israel, A, couldn't afford a fifth election, a fifth inconclusive election, couldn't afford a prime minister who, in Bennett's eyes, was focused more on his political needs and survival than on the needs of the country. Rightly or wrongly, that's what he perceived. Now, he understood that when he was willing to go into this government, he was going to alienate himself from his traditional right-wing base. But he felt the country was more important than his own more immediate political future. Yes, he was going to be prime minister for right around 2 years, but he also understood that he was losing his political base in the process. So it was an act of, I think in his mind, quite genuinely, an act of some political sacrifice for the sake of the country. Now, time will tell whether this proved to be true or not. But the fact is, I think that's the way he perceived it. And this is a government that is an unprecedented government in Israel.
Right.
It has the entire ideological spectrum represented in it. Never happened before. And it has an Arab party. Never happened before. And they actually function, notwithstanding their ideological differences, which are quite strong. They've identified the 70% of the issues that they can work on for the betterment of the country. And they have been, with their ups and downs, with their challenges, they have survived. They produced a budget. Bibi didn't have a budget for the last 3 years. One of the complaints of the IDF is that, Israel encouraged Trump to pull out of the JCPOA, but with no plan B, with no alternative. And the JCPOA, while the military and everyone else in Israel had basic questions about it, they were critical of it. The fact is, it bought time, and that time was being used to deal with other threats. There was not a major investment in developing the military capabilities Israel would need to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat if diplomacy failed. And so you see major new investments to create the options Israel will need if diplomacy fails. And I'd have to say, diplomacy at this point doesn't look like it's necessarily going to succeed when it comes to truly constraining the Iranian nuclear program over the long haul.
Yeah, we're going to come back to a separate question on that Iranian nuclear deal. But I do want to pick up on something you referred to, because I don't think that it's really understood just in terms of its transformative value, and that is that an Arab political party is part of an Israeli government. I mean, not that we need this. Those of us who are fervently supportive of the United State of Israel to say this is the full answer to the notion that it's an apartheid state. We don't need to do that, but it surely is. But there have been Arabs who have been advisors and being parts of government without it being the political party. But this is extraordinary, isn't it, that you have an Arab political party now with Bennett's government?
Well, it's unprecedented. And it's unprecedented because Mansour Abbas, who heads the Ram party, is an extraordinary figure. who has made it a mission of creating reconciliation between Arabs and Jews within Israel, among Israeli citizens. I mean, he's quite passionate about it. When you hear him, it's actually quite poignant and very meaningful. And he defines, unlike the other Arab parties who are part of the joint list, they typically in the Knesset act as if they're representing the Palestinians and not their own constituents. His approach is very different. His approach is, we Arab citizens have needs here, and they've been denied. We get a fraction of what the Jewish areas get in terms of infrastructure investment. When it comes to crime is rampant here. And yet we see very little evidence of the police here. So there were profound needs of his constituency, and he chose to represent his constituency, not act as if he was representing the Palestinians.
So you told us about two Israeli leaders who you profile in your book, who you knew quite well. One of them being Yitzhak Rabin, the other Ariel Sharon. Let's talk about another Israeli leader who you know extremely well, probably better than the other two. You can correct me if I'm wrong, and that's Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu was in power as the prime minister over 2 terms for a total of 15 years, the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, surpassing even David Ben-Gurion.
Yep.
Are we ready to write the political obituary for Bibi, or can you see him coming back and re-emerging?
I think one would always be extremely cautious after 15 years in power of deciding they know when the political denouement has taken place. I would never write him off. He is a master politician. One time he asked me, we were sitting alone when I was in the Obama administration, and he said to me, "Does Obama think he understands my politics better than I do?" To which I said, well, if he does, he shouldn't. He's a master politician. And he developed, he has a core constituency that is fervent in its belief of him. And doesn't matter what is out there, they will interpret things one way. And that's that constituency hasn't disappeared, even if it's a little smaller than it was. So he has he is a formidable political figure. The Likud party has only had 4 leaders in its entire existence. They don't change leaders like some people change, or some leaders change. Some people change socks, and some parties, change leaders. They don't do that. And so, is he political history? I don't think so. A lot will depend on, does he do a plea deal or not?
Mm-hmm.
And that depends on, for a plea deal, the former attorney general was making it very clear, for a plea deal, he had to accept responsibility, and there was going to be the clause of moral turpitude, which would have kept him out of politics for 7 years, which would have meant that was the end of his political life, his active political life. He obviously didn't agree to that, but a lot will depend upon how his lawyers read the judges. He's in a trial. The district court, it's 3 judges, no jury, 3 judges. And we'll have to see exactly how the trial goes. The fact that he was willing to do a plea deal suggested that his lawyers thought that was the prudent move to make, and he went along with it. So if there's a plea deal, well, then that probably spells the end of his political career. But maybe there won't be a plea deal now, and he continues to retain, as I said, probably among 35% of the country, he retains a strong level of support.
So when you look at a leader like Bibi Netanyahu, you know so well, who essentially was leader for about 20% of a country's history, 1/5 of the history of the country, surely his legacy has to be mixed, if indeed his political career is finished. So let's assume that for my next question. What do you see his legacy being?
he is someone who I think prided himself on being a specialist in the economy. And when he was the finance minister, he did a great deal to privatize the economy. And that turned out to be a huge boon for Israel's development. So I think that's probably his biggest legacy. He'll get some credit for the Abraham Accords, although he really wasn't the pusher of the Abraham Accords, but he responded when the opening was there. He'll get criticism, I think, for the way he dealt with the Palestinians, that there were moments where more could have been done, and he chose not to take what was possible. Look, he is a extremely talented individual. We're going to see a lot about whether or not the broader Israeli public has basically begun to move beyond him. His core constituency, the answer is no, they have not. A majority of Israelis, I think, may have. And I will tell you, one of the interesting things, again, Bibi has a lot of very strong supporters, and they seem to be self-motivated, but at times they're also, I guess I'll put it this way, they're choreographed, they're orchestrated.
Right.
And a lot of we saw a lot of that this week when some were out there sort of raising questions. Well, how could Bennett do this? How could Bennett be someone who's trying to be operating on the world stage? Bibi's campaign with these huge, long banners, as you drove into Tel Aviv or into Jerusalem, he was there with Trump, he was there in pictures with Trump, he was there with Putin, and then the caption was, "in a league of his own." So there was a kind of criticism of Bennett, how dare you go and do this? And it's a reminder, the longer Bibi is out of power, the harder it becomes for him to get back in. So I'm not writing him off, but if there's a plea deal, that probably spells the end of his career.
So one of the things that you wrote at the end of your book, and I like to quote the end of the book because it shows that I read the whole book, is that Israeli leaders probably still need America. I mean, I thought that was a very interesting observation. So let me connect the dots to Bibi and his legacy and ask you this, because one of the features of Bibi, particularly with Trump, but with congressional leaders, is his alignment with the Republican president and with the Republican leadership.
Yeah.
And is that part of his legacy? And is that a good thing?
The answer is yes, and it's a very negative part of his legacy. Israel was always an American interest, not a Republican or a Democratic interest. And he helped to turn it into a Republican, into a wedge issue. The problem with that is, one of the books I wrote was called Doomed to Succeed, and I go through every administration's relationship from Truman to today. The pendulum swings. For a major part of Israel's history, it was the Republicans who were much more hostile to Israel and the Democrats who were much more supportive. Pendulum swings. You put all your eggs in one basket and something changes there, you're in deep trouble. So, it is not in Israel's interest to lose its nonpartisan, bipartisan character in the United States. And Bibi, by going to the Congress, appealing over the head of the president, he did a great deal of damage to the Israeli image, and they're still feeling it with the progressive part of the party, with the Black Caucus in the House of Representatives. We're not out of the woods. Israel's not out of the woods on this issue, and it still takes a real serious effort to do outreach, especially to younger Israelis.
You referred to the Abraham Accords, and some of our audience may be familiar with it and some may not. It originally started with the UAE and it's expanded, and I just read a Bloomberg report that indeed Saudi Arabia is making some peace overtures. So what is the Abraham Accords briefly, and where do you see it going in the future?
The backdrop to the Abraham Accords is that the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, made a judgment in the person of their ambassador here, that, and I would say, with a number of people talking to him, that if Bibi went ahead with his declaration that he was going to annex the territories allotted to Israel in the Trump peace plan, that was going to end any possibility of expanding the circle of peace. The Emirates had, over a period of more than a decade, had been building a relationship of peace. Even before the Abraham Accords, there were 500 Israeli companies operating in the Gulf. Not on their Israeli passports, but they're Israelis, and everybody there knew who they were. But you can maintain certain kinds of fictions. The decision to annex, which was announced by Bibi Netanyahu the night that the Trump plan was unveiled, that put a lot of things at risk. And so when you ask about Bibi's legacy, I have to say that he built the economy in a very significant way, and that is part of his legacy. The Abraham Accords, even if the threat of annexation was not a tactic on his part, he wanted to do it. He saw it as defining his legacy as being the person who basically finally created Israel's border to the east. Now, it turned into 11, but that was not his intent. So, he gets credit in the end for the Abraham Accords. But he also, I think, has to take blame for what he did in terms of affecting the politics in this country. And I think he also has to, he also bears responsibility for Israel being very far down a track that's going to be hard to reverse, meaning moving towards one state. As I said, when I think of one state, I think of the rest of the region. I said earlier, one state, the Palestinians will say one person, one vote. And that will have a tremendous resonance. It's natural for us. But when I say one state, I also know one state is a prescription for an endless conflict. Look around the Middle East. There isn't one state that has more than one ethnic, sectarian, or tribal identity that is at peace with itself, not one state. Wherever you see this mix of nationalities and ethnicities, you see a state that it either is at war with itself or is paralyzed. So I think that too is part of his legacy, that he's moved things in that direction. Maybe all along he felt, I'm strong, I can, if I'm there, I can turn it around. On the Palestinians, he rarely evidenced that kind of behavior. He did with Arab states, but less so with the Palestinians.
So we have a question from one of our viewers. Her name is Audrey. And of course, I'm paraphrasing, but her question is, look, President Zelensky is looking for military assistance, for weapons. And indeed, Israel is one of the countries he wants help from. Do you foresee that as something that's realistic?
No. And this gets back to the Russians are Israel's neighbor now. And we in the Western world did nothing to stop that. When Putin first went in, many of Putin's first interventions were interventions with little green men, meaning Russian military men going in with no insignias, nothing to identify they were part of the military, because he was creating a plausible deniability if there was a strong pushback. This time, just the opposite. This time it was all overt. It was brazen. And the challenge here is to raise the cost, and which has been done. But we have to be able to put Putin in a position where he decides he has to seek a way out. Now I think we're the whole idea of supplying weapons. Israel finds itself in a position where Putin could crack down and say, you know what, we have these S-400 very sophisticated anti-aircraft system. Israel, for the most part, flies missions not over Syrian airspace, outside it, from Lebanon. It has what are known as standoff weapons. And, Israel cannot ignore the capabilities that Russia has there. The S-400 rocket could make it difficult for any Israeli planes even to take off. So Israel cannot be indifferent to the Russians being on their border. And that will affect the choices they have to make. My sense right now is that, that Israel is managing it pretty well. I don't think there's any Russian limitation to Israeli operations, but Israel also needs to be sure that this doesn't change, because you've ended up with, you're pretty much in a position where Putin decides I have to teach the Israelis a lesson.
So Dennis, you told us that you originally went to Israel on the premise of talking to high-level officials about the Iran nuclear deal, and of course, it detoured into a discussion, understandably, about mediation in the Russian invasion of Iraq. But let's look at that issue, because we know that the Biden administration is racing towards, signing the agreement again that was abandoned during the Donald Trump presidency.
Yeah.
And we know that Naftali Bennett in Israel fiercely opposes the signing of that agreement. So what's your analysis of this, and where do you see it going?
Bennett does oppose it, but he has made it very clear he's not going to go to war with the administration over it. He's not going to do what Netanyahu did. I will just tell you, look, I advised Netanyahu. I was outside the Obama administration at that point, but I was actually still doing back channel work. I advised him, you're not going to stop this. Why don't you see what you can get for it? And not as compensation, but as deterrence, because the threat to you is going to go up. As soon as you do it, and I said this to President Obama at the time. I had spent the first 3 years of his administration working on the Iran issue, and I left after 3 years. And he was anxious to have me support the JCPOA. And I said, look, one thing we know is that the Supreme Leader will want to validate, to show his ideology is still valid. For him, by doing a deal with you, he betrays everything he believes in, everything he talks about. So he's going to ratchet things up. He's going to make things worse in the region. You need to have some understanding with the Europeans about how we'll sanction that behavior so they understand this doesn't come cost-free. That's not what the Obama administration did. The challenge right now is to realize that if you don't do this deal, Iran will be enriching the weapons grade very quickly, within maybe a week or two. That's how close they are to breakout time now. They've spent the last 2 years perfecting their advanced centrifuges. This deal requires them to unplug those, at least for a couple of years, and then only gradually phase them in. It is a deal that could buy you time, stops the enrichment where it is now, doesn't go beyond 90%, reverses it back down to 3.67%, far from weapons grade. It requires all the excess material to be shipped out of the country. So there's some good things in this deal, but there's some bad things too. And that's what Bennett sees. On the one hand, all the advanced centrifuges that are dramatically more efficient and can enrich much more quickly. It's almost an exponential difference. All these, the Iranians will be able to do that starting in 2025. So when Bennett says we're only buying 2.5 years, that's what he means. The administration says we're buying until 2030. My point is, whatever time you're buying, what are you going to do with it? That's the issue. When I was in Israel, this was my point. I said, look, you're not going to stop this. That's clear. If the Iranians want it, it's going to happen, because the Biden administration wants to stop the advance of the Iranian nuclear program, because if they don't stop the advance of the Iranian nuclear program, they have to do something about it. So the challenge is, what are you going to do with the time you buy? How do you build deterrence of Iran, both for the nuclear program when the sunset provisions in the JCPOA lapse in the year 2030, and in terms of what they're doing in the region, because they're going to get a huge windfall of resources from this deal. The real Israeli problem is we're not buying a lot of time, and there's going to be a huge windfall for the Iranians, which they will use to expand the threats in the region, not just against us, but against all the other Arab states. So my argument was, okay, reach a set of understanding with the administration now about what you and we and the other Arabs will do together to counter the Iranians in the region. That's where the focus has to be. It seems counterintuitive. This is supposedly designed to stop the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon. And what I'm saying is, you want to build deterrence, you start in the region. The reason you start in the region is because if it becomes very clear to the Iranians that you're prepared to counter them even at the low end of the spectrum in conflict, imagine what you'll do on the high end. Now, that's also necessary for the administration to be able to do the things it wants to do, meaning rely more on countries in the region for their own defense. But those countries need to see we aren't shy. We aren't going to leave them in a lurch. Right now, they don't trust us. That's a problem. They don't think we'll be there. They don't think we're reliable. The way Afghanistan was done created a dramatic manifestation of doubts they already had. They were watching the last three administrations. Obama, who, after doing the JCPOA, turned a blind eye to everything the Iranians did, and they ratcheted up threats in the region. Trump, you had the most important Saudi oil processing facility was attacked directly by the Iranians, not by their proxies. Cruise missiles and drones were launched from Iranian territory and took out the most important oil processing facility in Aramco in Saudi Arabia. There was an expectation this was going to have a dramatic effect on cutting their oil production. They were able to get it back in service within 2 weeks. I tell the story because Trump said, well, it was an attack on Saudi Arabia, not on us. The most important oil processing facility in Aramco, where the concern initially was it might be out of commission 6 months, and it affected half of their daily oil production. And Trump's response was, attack on them, not us. And Biden comes in, and Biden says, we're going to assume leadership again. But the perception in the region is we seem to be chasing after the Iranians on this deal, and it's going to give the Iranians a windfall. So if you want to reassure the countries in the region, you start by countering what the Iranians are doing in the region, especially if we see the JCPOA is concluded. Now, the Russians, one more point on this. The Russians seem to, as we say, put a spoke in the wheel, because they're now saying that their trade with Iran should not be subject to the sanctions. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to make that a condition of concluding this. Now, the Iranians, by the way, are not too happy because they want this deal. This deal is very good for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you said in an interview was that by Trump abandoning the agreement, he just encouraged the hardliners in Iran to emerge more forcefully. So that's one of the ancillary effects of not having this agreement.
It is.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dennis. I
was just going to say, let me summarize what the Iranians have done. The Iranians are enriching to 60%. That takes about a week to get to 90%. 90% is weapons grade. Mm-hmm. Once they have weapons grade, they have the hardest thing to, if you're going to produce a nuclear weapon, the hardest thing to produce is weapons grade fissile material. A delivery vehicle, they already have. Now, turning it into a weapon itself is not, is also, it takes some effort, but it's not the technological effort that it takes to produce weapons grade fissile material. When you hear the term breakout refers to being able to get to the point where you can produce weapons grade fissile material. They're a week or two away from that right now.
Okay.
So they're using their advanced centrifuges to enrich to 20%, which is highly enriched uranium. And it's not a great leap to go from there to 60%. That means they worked out all the bugs. So they have used the walkaway that his walkaway, they used to unleash themselves in a nuclear program. The reason that JCPOA, even if you get back into it, it doesn't produce all that much is because they fundamentally changed the baseline of their program in the last 2 years.
Okay. So we have 2 more areas to cover. With your permission, Dennis, I'll just go a couple minutes past 8 o'clock, but I just wanted to let everyone know that we're going to have 15 minutes of beautifully melodic sting music available. If you want to grab some juice or a glass of wine, that'll be playing in the green room after the program ends. And also, just to let you know, our next program is going to be a preview of the Oscars, the Academy Awards, with 2 brilliant film critics, Richard Krause from Canada and Hornaday from the Washington Post. We had them last year. It's going to be a special 90-minute edition. You say, well, why do I want to watch? I haven't seen the movies. But you'll want to watch the movies after you watch this program. And my prediction is that Belfast is going to win Best Picture. So with that, let me turn to the last 2 areas with you, Dennis. And the first is Canada. We have a prime minister who's on the world stage, who was actually criticized by a CBC reporter. You should know, what is he doing out in Europe? He should be home dealing with domestic issues. Does it matter what Canada says and does on the international stage, specifically dealing with the Middle East?
Well, it always depends on the issue. If you ask me, when it comes to trying to mediate Arab-Israeli peace, Canada is not going to be an arbiter. But Canada can be a contributor, and it has been. When you look at G7 meetings, Canada is a significant player. There are issues on which Canada creates a significant voice. So, this may not be what you're used to hearing from an American, and certainly a former American official, but Canada is a country that is very much in the consciousness and the mindset of American policymakers. They may not always act like it, but the reality is quite there. It's true that maybe there are times when Canada is taken for granted by the United States. And then from time to time, the Canadian Prime Minister will give us a wake-up call. And it's a good thing that they do.
So everyone watching this program has an organic connection to Medina, Israel, the state of Israel. So I thought the most important question I'd ask you is about the future. You've already referred to this diverse coalition of Prime Minister Bennett that seems fragile, at least from a distance, and almost extraordinary that it's lasted this long to an observer like me, and including an Arab political party. So looking ahead to the future, are you optimistic about this government moving forward, staying in power, and doing good things?
It's a hard question, because I had someone who's part of this government describe it as a political miracle.
Right.
And that implies, okay, is it a miracle is not something you necessarily say is going to be there forever. That said, I have to say the way they have worked has been pretty remarkable. They have forged compromises. If I were to bet today, the betting wisdom when this government came in was it would not last at all. Bibi announced, we'll be back before anybody knows it. Well, they passed a budget, and he didn't do it for 3 years. Uh, they seem very mindful of their responsibilities. There are areas where they clearly disagree, and they've tried to put those aside. They don't agree on what the outcome with the Palestinians should be. You have the right wing within the government doesn't believe in a Palestinian state. The center left does. But they have put their differences to the side for what they say are the 70% of things that they actually agree on. And they have changed, they want to change the tenor of the political conversations to end the demonization that has been rampant. That clearly seems to be a kind of mission that they feel. So I would not have said at the beginning that I give this government a great chance to last for the full 4 years. But I have to say, I'm beginning to change my view because of how smartly they have operated, how well they have worked out compromises, and how committed they seem to be to fulfilling why this government was formed in the first place, to do good governance.
All right. Well, what a wonderful way to end. And thank you, Dennis, for your insightful, your engaging, your thoughtful, and your provocative views this evening. It's just been an honor and a pleasure to have you as our guest. And I know I'm speaking. And Zoom, you can only speak for people because they can't even nod. But I know that they're nodding in approval. I have no doubt about it. So thank you again for being with us.
My pleasure. I was glad to be with you.
My pleasure. And the kavod is ours. And I want to thank all of you. Again, this is my 20th program. I've insisted on a pay raise, by the way. And I look forward to seeing you again this month. And remember, beautiful music coming. And thank you again for being with Evenings with Steve. Have a good night, everyone.